Good morning, students. In the last class, we talked about the regulation of the cardiovascular system, and I talked about the chemical regulation of the cardiovascular system. Today, we shall discuss the neural regulation of cardiovascular system. Now, whenever the neural regulation of any system comes into the picture, it becomes a complicated one. But I shall try my best to present it as lucidly as practicable. Now, before going into the neural regulation, we shall have to have a clear-cut concept regarding the innervation of the cardiovascular system. That means the nerve supply of the heart and the blood vessels. Number two, hierarchy of that innervation. That is where from the superior control of that nerve supply is coming. These two things, that is the innervation of the cardiovascular system and hierarchy of the innervation of the cardiovascular system, are the two important points for discussion of the neural regulation of the cardiovascular system. Now, if we consider the different centers of the cardiovascular system, we shall have to have a focus on the most important cardiovascular system, which is located in the medulla oblongata, and that system or the center is known as the vasomotor center or VMC. Before going into the details of the VMC, we shall talk something about the nerve supply of the cardiovascular system. Now, you know quite well the autonomic nervous systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve fibers, they innervate the different systems of our biological system. Now, the nerve supply to the heart as well as the vascular smooth muscle, they are from the autonomic nervous system, and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, you know quite well, are the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Now, if we consider the sympathetic nerve supply to the cardiovascular system, the sympathetic supplies the cardiac muscle fibers, which supplies the SA node, AV node, and the His-Purkinje system. And the parasympathetic nerve fiber supplies only the SA node and the AV node and the atrial muscle fibers. Parasympathetic does not go beyond the atrial muscle fibers or atrium. Now, on the other hand, so far as the vascular nerve supply is concerned, it is the sympathetic which dominates the picture. Now, the sympathetic supplies all the vascular smooth muscle present whatsoever in our biological system, whereas the parasympathetic has got virtually no supply to the vascular smooth muscle, excepting a few exceptional circulations like the cerebral and the coronary. Now, if this be the fact of innervation, then we shall have to have a very good concept regarding the hierarchy of the autonomic nervous system. Now, I was talking about this important vasomotor center. Now, this vasomotor center is the most important sympathetic nervous system center in the medulla, and this is in turn controlled by a number of inputs. And those inputs are, number one, coming from the higher centers, that is from the cerebral cortex, and also from the limbic system. This is the higher center input to the vasomotor center. Now, apart from these higher center inputs, there are other inputs to the vasomotor centers are there, and they are from the blood supplying the vasomotor center. That is the composition of the blood which supplies the vasomotor center, and the parameters of the blood which influence the vasomotor center are the pH of blood, namely and mainly, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood supplying the vasomotor center. These two are very, very important so-called chemical composition of the blood that influence the VMC, vasomotor center. And other inputs to the VMC are the different receptors which are present in the heart itself, that is atrial chamber, ventricular chambers, and the different receptors which are present in the great arteries, main arteries, big arteries, of which the most important are the baroreceptors, which are situated in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Carotid sinus is such a place which is located at the commencement of the internal carotid artery, where the common carotid artery breaks into internal and the external carotid artery. So at the beginning of the internal carotid artery, there is a dilatation which constitutes the carotid sinus, and also located in the aorta, arch of the aorta, another baroreceptor. So these two receptors, that is the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, are the main peripheral baroreceptors which sends impulse to the vasomotor center. So that is another input. Next, the baroreceptors from other arteries. Apart from the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, there are so many arteries in our body. From those arteries, the baroreceptor sends their impulse to the vasomotor center. Now, if you consider the higher impulse to the vasomotor centers, apart from the cerebral cortex and the limbic cortex, hypothalamus, which is a very, very important structure which supplies the vasomotor center or influence the vasomotor center in such a manner that the activity of the vasomotor center is controlled by the hypothalamus. So, if we consider the hypothalamus as well as the vasomotor center, that we will see that in the hypothalamus there are two important areas. One is the depressor area, another is the pressure area, that is the DA and the PA over here. So also in the vasomotor center there is a depressor area and the pressure area. The pressure areas are mainly for sending stimulatory impulse to the next order neuron, and the depressor areas are mainly for sending the inhibitory impulse to the next order neuron. So if this be the fact, so there is an opposition of the different types of stimuli coming from the hypothalamus to the vasomotor center and from the vasomotor center to the lower center, that is in the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, there are two types of gray matters which are located at the center of the spinal cord. One is at the lateral side, known as intermediolateral gray column, which is actually the seat of origin of the sympathetic nerve fibers from the spinal cord. And another is the intermediomedial gray column, which is responsible for inhibiting the intermediolateral gray column whenever necessity arises. So, we are just finding right from the higher cortex via the hypothalamus, via the vasomotor center to the spinal cord, and the vasomotor center being influenced by numerous stimuli like blood pH, partial pressure of oxygen, peripheral receptors from the arteries and the arterioles, and also from the heart itself, that it goes to the vasomotor center to influence it. And the vasomotor center causes stimulation of the intermediolateral column of the spinal cord, so that the intermediolateral column of the spinal cord, I have shown over another picture at the side panel, that when the vasomotor center discharge is coming to the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord, that sends the efferent sympathetic fiber to a nearby ganglion known as the sympathetic chain of ganglion, and after relaying over there, the postganglionic fibers are going to the target organ to supply the target organ. So this is the anatomical picture of the autonomic nervous system right from its origin from the hypothalamus and its influence on the vasomotor center and the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord, which is the actual origin of the sympathetic nerve fibers, are there. So if we consider that these different impulses which are going to the vasomotor center in such a manner that they normally influence the vasomotor center to control its discharge. Actually what happens, the vasomotor center, if severed from the influences of other inputs, it is tonically active. It always discharges stimulatory impulse to the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord, and from there to the via the sympathetic nerve fibers, efferent sympathetic nerve fibers, to the target organ. So if we consider the different aspects, say for example the blood pH is lowered due to any cause, that is the acidosis is there, and if the partial pressure of oxygen is low, that is hypoxia is there. I am considering these two factors, how they influence the vasomotor center to compensate for the already existing pathology. So this blood pH is lowered, that means acidosis is there, systemic acidosis, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low over there, that is hypoxia is there. These two conditions will stimulate the vasomotor center, and that will in turn stimulate the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord, and that will discharge through the efferent sympathetic fiber and will target organ, that means the heart and the blood vessels will be stimulated. There will be increased contractility of the myocardium, there will be increased heart rate, that will lead to increased blood supply to the organ concerned and thereby compensating for the already existing hypoxia. So this is one of the compensatory mechanisms how in different conditions they act. Say for example the baroreceptors. If we come to the baroreceptors, they are the very important receptors which control the blood pressure in such a manner that whenever there is any change, momentary change in the blood pressure, it is immediately compensated for by these two receptors. That is, they are located in two strategic locations. One is in the carotid artery, which supplies the head and neck, and another is the arch of the aorta, which is supplying the rest of the body. So these are the two strategic locations where the baroreceptors are situated, and whenever they are stimulated, say for example the person is having hypertension, increased blood pressure, systemic arterial blood pressure, so that causes stretching of the receptors present in the wall of the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. These receptors are nothing but the nerve endings of two important cranial nerves. One is the 9th cranial nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal. Another is the 10th cranial nerve, that is the vagus. 9th from the carotid sinus and the 10th from the aortic arch. The standard teaching is like this. So if they are stimulated whenever the person suffers from the increased blood pressure, then the impulses are carried by the 9th and the 10th cranial nerve via a nucleus located in the medulla itself, known as nucleus of tractus solitarius, relay over there, and the fibers are coming from those nucleus tractus solitarius to vasomotor center, which inhibits the vasomotor center by releasing an inhibitory interneuron known as gamma aminobutyric acid. And at the same time, these same neurons, that is the 9th and the 10th cranial nerve, after relaying into the nucleus tractus solitarius, relays or supplies the nearby another important center in the medulla known as the Nucleus Ambiguus, previously known as the Cardio-Inhibitory Center or CIC. And that center is supposed to be the origin of the vagus nerve from the medulla. So here the same stimulus carried by the 9th and the 10th cranial nerves, they just stimulate the nucleus ambiguus. And if this be the fact, the neurotransmitter over here must be a stimulatory one, and that neurotransmitter is known as the glutamate. So whenever this nucleus ambiguus is stimulated as a result of increased impulse traffic through the 9th and 10th cranial nerve, what happens? The nucleus ambiguus, which is the origin of the vagus nerve in the medulla, starts firing, and the fibers go to the heart, and there is inhibition of the myocardium. You know quite well that whenever the vagus or the parasympathetic supply to the heart is inhibitory and the sympathetic supply to the heart is stimulatory, as I told you earlier regarding the innervation part. Now, so if this be the fact, so whenever there is a raised blood pressure, what will happen? There will be inhibition of the vasomotor center, and there will be stimulation of the nucleus ambiguus or the so-called vagal center in the middle. So what will happen? There will be decreased contractility of the myocardium, there will be decreased heart rate, there will be decreased excitability of the myocardium, there will be decreased conduction of impulse velocity in the myocardium, and on the other hand, as a result of stimulation of the vagus nerve, there will be diminished heart rate. So what will happen? There will be diminished blood pressure, both the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure, because the cardiac output will be diminished, which will lead to reduction of the systemic blood pressure, the systolic blood pressure. And as a result of the vasodilatation, as a result of decreased sympathetic discharge, there will be diminution of the diastolic blood pressure. So we will have decreased blood pressure into the system. The initial stimulus was increased blood pressure into the system. So by virtue of this complex neural circuitry, that increased blood pressure is brought back to a normal one. This is known as the homeostasis of the blood pressure. Homeostasis, or rather regulation of the blood pressure. So that is also included into the regulation of the cardiovascular system. In that sense, I am telling this one over here. Now, this whole thing, that is the vasomotor center and the vagal center and this hierarchy, that is the hypothalamus and the cerebral cortex and all this, if they are considered together, whenever there is any cardiovascular emergency, any disturbance in the homeostasis of the cardiovascular system, they start acting in unison. Not only that, if there is any crisis so far as the metabolic system of our biology is concerned, then these centers start functioning in unison, in a concerted manner, and brings back the homeostasis of the system. So far as the composition of the blood is concerned, so far as the blood pressure is concerned, so far as the blood supply to the different organs are concerned. So this is in fact the system which is always functioning in a concerted manner, by virtue of which the cardiovascular status is regulated, implying the fact that the neural mechanism is a very, very potent and competent mechanism whenever there is any urgency of the regulation of the cardiovascular system is concerned. Now, one important thing I must say before going into the penultimate portion of my lecture, that is, from the cerebral cortex, you see one nerve fiber is coming directly to the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord, bypassing the hypothalamus. At times may pass to the hypothalamus, but in the majority of the cases it is said that in mammals it bypasses the hypothalamus and goes directly, or even rather bypasses the vasomotor center and goes directly. You see, just from the cerebral cortex, the fibers as well as from the limbic system, they are coming into the vasomotor center to exert their influence. Say, for example, whenever there is an emotional disturbance, rage, panic, and all these things, there is some change, alteration in the cardiovascular status, and this is done by the nerve supply right from the cerebral cortex and the limbic system to the vasomotor center and the subsequent hierarchy. But here, this is an exceptional fiber which is coming directly from the cerebral cortex and going into the intermediolateral gray column of the spinal cord to stimulate the spinal cord and discharge impulses from the spinal cord to some exceptional structures of our body. And those exceptional structures are the sweat gland, piloerector muscles, and the vascular smooth muscles of the arterioles supplying the skeletal muscle. vascular smooth muscle of the arterioles supplying the skeletal muscles. These three organs are exceptionally supplied by these direct fibers from the cerebral cortex via the intermediolateral gray column without any intermediation of the intervening centers. So if this be the fact, so this constitutes another important portion of the sympathetic nervous system, and that sympathetic nervous system is known as the sympathetic vasodilator system. Normally, we have seen earlier that whenever there is any sympathetic stimulation, all the blood vessels of our body, they constrict. They constrict because there is release of noradrenaline from the postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers, which causes constriction of the vascular smooth muscle. But here, this system, sympathetic vasodilator system, causes dilatation of the blood vessels of the muscles which constitute the smooth muscle of the blood vessels of the skeletal muscles. So the vascular smooth muscle of the arterioles supplying the skeletal muscles, they are innervated by this sympathetic vasodilator system, also known as the sympathetic cholinergic system. Why? Because these fibers at their postganglionic portion release acetylcholine instead of noradrenaline, and that acetylcholine causes dilatation of the smooth muscle of those particular structures. So this is known as the sympathetic vasodilator system. This operates side by side whenever there is any extreme discharge from the cerebral cortex in some situations. Say for example, if the person is hearing a bad news, hearing a very shocking news, or standing for a prolonged period in a situation which is very clumsy, and then suddenly he or she falls down as a result of massive vasodilatation, and this particular phenomenon is known as the vasovagal attack. We call it vasovagal attack. This vasovagal means this sympathetic vasodilator system is mainly responsible for the dilatation, massive dilatation of the blood vessels which supply the skeletal muscles. Because if you consider the skeletal muscles, from top to bottom there are so many skeletal muscles, so their arterioles will constitute a huge portion of the circulatory system, peripheral circulatory system. Right? Am I clear? So if this be the fact, then we can conclude by saying that as the chemical regulation was there, I told you in the last class, the neural regulation is a bit complicated. It takes place as a result of the integration of the different levels of the systems, nervous systems, because the main motto of the neural regulation is to control the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve fibers. That is the autonomic nerve fibers. As I told you earlier, that we shall have to have a clear-cut idea regarding the innervation of the cardiovascular system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, as well as the hierarchy of the innervation. That is very, very important. That if you consider this intermediolateral gray column is the lowest center for the sympathetic, then immediately higher one is the vasomotor center, then higher to that is the hypothalamus, and then higher to that is the cerebral cortex and the limbic system. If we consider in this manner, so it definitely constitutes a very, very integrated hierarchical system of the autonomic nervous system, so that whenever there is any emergency which occurs, as I told you, the sudden rise of blood pressure, which is immediately counterbalanced by the baroreceptor reflex, or sudden decrement in the blood flow of any organ, there is dilatation of the blood vessels due to the diminished sympathetic discharge. Unopposed sympathetic discharge causes dilatation of the blood vessels because the blood vessels are not supplied by the parasympathetic nerve fibers. Normally, the vascular smooth muscle tone is maintained by the tonic sympathetic discharge. Sympathetic discharges tonically. Why? Because the vasomotor center discharges tonically. It is a different inputs which alters that tonicity of discharge. So, as a result of the lower down center, the intermediolateral gray column will also discharge in a tonic fashion to the vascular smooth muscles as well as to the myocardium or the cardiac muscle fibers. So, in conclusion, we can say that the neural regulation of the cardiovascular system in conjunction with the chemical regulation discussed in my last class, they are always trying to maintain the homeostasis of the cardiovascular system. That is, they regulate the cardiovascular system in such a manner that the person can survive any emergency whatsoever in his daily life. Thank you.